I just want to sort of bring up what I consider is sort of the elephant in the room, which is how successful the project development has been over the last 50, 60, 70 years, in spite of all these failures. And as a sociologist, or maybe just as an interested, engaged person, without a discipline, I think it's always interesting to study the ways in which power works, such that certain questions cannot be asked and certain questions are the emphasis. And what do I mean? I mean, if you pick up the New York Times today, you typically have, whenever it's talking about this place called Africa, it's about nutrition levels, it's about literacy rates, it's about gross domestic product, it's about trade barriers, it's about corruption, it's about good government. None of that is considered political. Most of it's considered academic. That is, we take it for granted. We have, and what I try to argue in my book, and I just sort of throw out here as the first claim, is that what the development community led by the World Bank has been so successful at is basically setting the parameters about which we're allowed to speak about North-South relations, such that it is hard to talk about Botswana or Ghana or Algeria in any other way but through the discourse of development. And I see that as a remarkable and problematic success. It's hard to talk about the complexity of Africa outside of the metrics that are easily provided to us in terms of nutrition levels, poverty rates, GDPs, and what have you. So I brought a New York Times. I mean, if you pick up the New York Times, that's typically the language which presents a problem in the quote-unquote third world. And this is a paper that I'd like to suggest is an reimagining of development. It was produced by the Yes Men. And the title, the headline is Iraq War Ends. It's not typically part of the development discourse to talk about war. It says that nationalize oil to fund climate change efforts throughout the United States. It's not typically a topic of the whatever discipline in the realm of development. Another title, Maximum Wage Law Succeeds. I don't think there's ever been a development organization that has ever put a proposal for a grant to the World Bank suggesting that a country in Africa should have a maximum wage law, right? And so, I mean, this is sort of a joke, right? I mean, this was produced by the Yes Men. But it sort of opens our eyes to remind ourselves what it is that we don't talk about, what we're not allowed to talk about when we talk about development. And that is politics. And so I just want to throw out some little bit of sort of, information that suggests to me that we have to pose the question, how can we talk about North-South relations using a language outside the world of development, and then use that language to reconsider or reimagine development? I mean, I think it's important to recognize the World Bank, the largest lender in the world of development, and also a leader, that is, other agencies, smaller, follow. That right after 9/11, 70 to 90% of the money it lent in 2002 went to 3 or 4 countries: Pakistan, Turkey, countries that basically the United States was trying to win over in the war, war against terror. In spite of the nutritionists, the agronomists, the educators, the most nuanced and sophisticated development experts that the World Bank has working for them, they basically lent to the countries that were on the target range, or the place where the American military pilots needed to land for the Iraq War. Which agency did the world community point to as the lead agency to rebuild Iraq? The World Bank. How is it that the World Bank, for all its efforts about planting food in Africa, fighting water scarcity in Asia, basically funneled all its money to 3 to 4 countries? The question I'm trying to pose is, with these sort of simple facts, is to realize that we have to do a better genealogy of the world of development to realize that a lot of these things, such as militarism, are never spoken of in development. And if you do work in Cambodia or Zimbabwe or wherever you might work, and you talk about militarism, you can't work there. So how can we have a conversation about the relationship between the global south and the global north, not use the language of development, and maybe as an effort to reach the kind of goals that we have, that most of the development community has, which is reducing poverty and what have you. Nothing more could be important to the world of development than to end the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet those are the two most forbidden conversations you can possibly have in a development community. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and we only have 10 minutes, but it is important to realize that the sort of roots of the World Bank, that set up at the end of World War II to rebuild Europe, and then after that to rebuild the colonies of Europe. And most of the money that was first lent, and the World Bank was very narrowly disciplined, economists, lawyers, at the start, mostly lent to rebuild the ports, the trade, the railroads, and the mines that had been defunded during World War II. Yeah, that is to bring the natural resources out of the colonies or the ex-colonies to feed the global economy with essential and cheap raw materials to rebuild the global economy. In the first 30 years of the World Bank, they never talked about poverty, or they were never about participation or the needs of the poor. It was really about the needs of the global economy. It was only in the 60s and the 70s, the Vietnam War, where Robert McNamara took over the World Bank, where the conversation shifted to winning over the hearts and minds of the people in the global South, where the conversation shifted to the questions that we now take for granted as the core of development, which is poverty alleviation. But it's also important to remember that as Deutsche Bank just stated in its annual report, that we only invest in emerging economies when we can get a guaranteed 25% rate of return, which means that most global north agencies, banks, are only interested in investing in what they call emerging economies, poorer countries, if they can get a 25% rate of return. Walmart gets like a 4% rate of return as the largest retailer in the world. So we should take Deutsche Bank seriously. Now why? We're talking about development, we're not talking about banks. Well, the largest investor in microcredit enterprises, which is the language of the day in development, is Citibank. So why not take them for their word, rather than imagine something else? And the reason why I bring up these Wall Street and these companies is you ask, well, this has nothing to do with development. It's just a simple fact of the largest lender, which is the World Bank, is that it gets most of its money from Wall Street. A little known fact that hardly gets discussed in development communities because it's nothing you can do about it. But most of its money comes from two sources, the World Bank. It comes from AAA World Bank bonds floated across currencies, which has a rate of return similar to what Deutsche Bank expects of its bonds. And the other place that it gets most of its money to lend for projects that we would care about in the development community are from debt repayments, right? The largest remittances, if you will, from the World Bank are coming from poor countries who are highly in debt to the World Bank. So you have this sort of vice, where on the one hand, most of the loans that go to development projects from the World Bank, not from Oxfam, but from the World Bank, actually come back to the North in terms of their firms being hired to do the work. So, for example, during the 90s, when we were pulling our hair out about water scarcity in major cities throughout the global South, it only became rational and obvious that the plan in the 1990s, floated by a development community caring about global water scarcity, was to privatize water systems in cities from Johannesburg to Jakarta. It only made sense. And the lion's share of that money that went to development loans having to deal with water scarcity went to companies like Bechtel and Vivendi, who have these expectations, their shareholders have these expectations of rate of returns. So the question is, how can we talk about the critical issues of development, such as water scarcity, and realize that the solutions typically are to bring in European-style European-style solutions, which is essentially lending money to countries to hire German and American and French firms to come to deal with the pivotal problem of water scarcity. Most of the large cities in the global south have, most of the populations have little access to water scarcity, to clean and potable water, and enough water to fight disease and to live a healthy life. The question I have to ask is, why is it that in the discourse of development there seems to be no alternative but to bring in to do it the European way? I only have 3 minutes left, right? So I can't really develop this line, this narrative too far. But I think you sort of get the essence of it. Is that I think one of the things that I learned most from doing an ethnography of the World Bank and the people it works with is that there are two separate conversations. One is on Wall Street, which I've listened to, and it's all about capitalization of undercapitalized public sector services throughout the global south. And then it's the development community, which talks about how do we bring water to the poor? How do we fight AIDS? And rather than cutting across disciplines, we have to cut across power lines, I think. We have to figure out how to cut across and understand more in a material way what are actually the practices when we call for we need more water, we need more efficient water systems in our cities. That the answer, at least during the 90s and the 2000s, has always been the same answer. So what are the power relations such that it's very hard to actualize a development solution outside that kind of discourse? And I'm saying that it's something that's built up over time. Now, once, if I had like a simple remedy, is to maybe just for a moment suspend our thinking that we're really in the world of development, in the business of development, and in the fighting for struggles around development, and realize that it is a relationship, right? That is, as Aiden Foster Carter said 40 years ago, it's about underdevelopment. And there's a subject and an object. I underdevelop you. Now, if we started from that basis, we ask the question, well, how did this underdevelopment process happen such that half the population in the world's cities are without water? Rather than start 2/3 of the way into the historical conversation and say, yeah, the government doesn't work, the pipes don't run, we know how to run pipes, let's run the pipes. We can go like that, and then we can start, be leapfrog over all the problems of the third world. So if we start that, we realize that we're no longer talking about development. We're talking about a genealogy of power that takes seriously the history of expropriation and extraction in countries, whether it's internal or transnational. We realize that maybe we shouldn't focus so much about the global south when we're talking about underdevelopment, that we should talk about the relationship between north and south. So how is it that the Congo is the wealthiest country in the world in terms of natural resources, that all our phones and our computers depend upon those resources for our wealth, and yet they're the poorest, and the government is the most broken and the most militarized country in the world. So we have to ask the question, not so much why is it that fishermen and fisherwomen who live along Lake Victoria, who are producing the wealth of fish that Europeans can eat and eat cheaply, is not why is it they have AIDS, and why is it that is that their children are sold to slavery, and why is it that they're constantly fighting the age-old problems of poverty? The question is, why is so much wealth produced and poverty created? Right? I mean, they're producing Europe's wealth, and they're still fighting, and they're not still fighting. They're being underdeveloped. Every Nile perch that they pull out of that river is creating poverty. So instead of, I feel, and I'm being, the little flea on the elephant's back here, but I think that we really need to refocus and think less about the metrics and perfecting the metrics in the global south and try to understand, wealth accumulation in the north. And to do that, we sort of shift our language to questions of social justice. And and the way in which, as our moderator suggested, the way in which we can think through the lens of social justice and then reinvigorate our conversations about development, I think it's not a question of disciplines. I think it's a question of kind of rethinking the interdisciplinary conversation about development and putting it back into history. And then I think we don't have easy solutions, but I think the conversation changes in a way where we actually put our finger on the pulse of power rather than powerlessness.